I have a question for Mr. Ivanov. Could I ask you a comment on the recent President Assad's position, which indicate longer time than expected by the United States and Russia in implementing obligations of the treaty to ban chemical weapons? Thank you.
Michael McClay.
Thank you, John. My question also goes to Mr. Ivanov, with congratulations for a very fine speech. If I could pick up on your Chapter 7 point, you correctly brought out the importance of Chapter 7 and linked that with the need for consultation and consensus. Would your ideal outcome be that on the basis of extensive consultation and indeed consensus, there could ultimately be some form of Chapter 7 action if necessary, or are your strictures on the use of force such that you would exclude Chapter 7 action under all circumstances? There are, after all, possible ways of proceeding towards enforcement that do not involve the use of force. Thank you.
Mr. Ralph.
Thank you very much. I also have a question to Mr. Ivanov. The UN Secretary. Yeah. The UN Secretary General has his mechanism for the investigation of allegations of chemical weapon use, and this mechanism was triggered in the case of Syria. Yet before this mechanism could reach its conclusions, at least 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council reached their own independent conclusions. So from your point of view, where does this lead the Secretary General's mechanism and its findings vis-a-vis the findings of the other countries? Thank you.
Igor Jurgens.
Just for the change, I want to save some time for Mr. Ivanov, and I asked my question from Mr. Eikenberry, who was the ambassador of the United States to Afghanistan. We're in the process of getting out of Afghanistan. I hope that by 2014 you're cutting down seriously. We're very concerned about Central Asia. We're very concerned about our allies on CSTO in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and other nations. Why United States NATO command always say no to the advances of Mr. Bardyuzha and as a commander of CSTO, saying that let's unite our forces a little bit in this peaceful resolution of some of the potential conflicts? Why do you say that CSTO is not an option for camaraderie in this conflict?
Ms. Sajima.
I also have a question towards Mr. Ivanov, and I'm really happy with Russian recent proposal about the Syrian issues, but for me, East Asian countries, I'm just worried about this approach will send wrong message towards a country like North Korea. Is it just a small question?
Thank you. Yusuf Mashal.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Ivanov, but that's also a question for you. It seems that what puzzles me always is a question to the Russian government is why now? Why after Afghanistan, after Libya, after Iraq, why now? What has changed? And secondly, are we going to expect a more Russian diplomacy in the preparation for the new Middle East that the US is talking about? Thank you.
Mr. Baldassari.
I am an economist and I've been working for decades with game theory. So I'm trying to apply into your speech my little tool. What I see is some kind of paradox of democracy or social consensus. In each single countries or in each single critical point in the world, like Colombia, Syria, Afghanistan, we have the majority of people understanding that peace, social inclusions, justice is a public good. And this is some kind of positive sum game. So if you sum up the 70% majority in each critical situation, I mean in terms of people, we should come up with a consensus about the positive sum game through peace. How happened, this is my question, that maybe a clear minority within each single reality, each single country, can become the ruler, forcing toward a negative sum game for everybody in the world, but a positive game with positive profit for themselves. So the question is, do we need a new G8 about the consensus that Mr. Ivanov started as his own issue this morning? A new G8 based on this positive sum game around the world and new rules for the United Nations as the assembly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Dowdy?
As I was listening to the first and the third speaker, the first commenting on Syria and the third on Afghanistan, I was personally struck by the fact that there were more similarities than differences in outlook. I'd appreciate it if both of you could reflect and comment upon that and see if I've heard you correctly.
Thank you very much. Alex Nichol?
Thank you. My question is to General Eikenberry, but I think it's also relevant to the Minister from Colombia as well. And that is, how much do you think that the lessons that you so wisely drew from the intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq have really been absorbed in the US military establishment? And is it possible to hazard a guess as to what the longer-term effects on the US military will be of what's happened in the past decade? And I think that's also a question that might be relevant to the Colombian minister also.
From the United States of Mexico, Andres Rosenthal.
Thank you, John. To Minister Pinzón, a double question. First of all, does he think that the peace process that's currently underway will finalize this year, as President Santos has expressed a desire to do so? And secondly, why is it that President Santos's popularity has dropped so tremendously, given all of the more positive parts of what you spoke to us about?
Oder Abodin.
I have a question and a comment to our Russian guests and our American speaker. When we talk about intervention, for the past 200 years in Arab and Islamic countries, we start in Algeria in 1832, and we go to the British occupation of Iraq in 1920, and then we go to Vietnam, and then Iraq and Afghanistan. It seems to me policymakers, decision makers in the West have failed, and also with the Russian intervention in Afghanistan, that policymakers ignore something which I call the psychology of the people we are invading or intervening in, and their capacity to endure. We had seen this in Vietnam, we have seen this in Iraq, and in your talks, nobody mentioned that we should take into account the psychology of these people, especially Arab and Muslim psychology.
Mr. Paparone? Yeah.
My name is Andreas Paparone, and I'm working for the Swiss MOD. Speaking of being fair, I would like to thank Sergei Ivanov for his very precise outline of the Russian position. And I understand your concern about the democracy threat, pun intended, which poses itself to the government in Damascus. To quote you, you said, Russia is prepared to do all it can to end the war in Syria. So my question is, what can Russia do to end the war in Syria, apart from maintaining a significant naval presence off the coast and promoting the rule of law? Thank you.
Mr. Mohammed, and I'll take two more and then we'll come back to the panel. That's it.
Thank you. My question actually to the Russian minister, actually, about, he mentioned something about the mechanism of the weapons of mass destruction. Being a member of the Security Council, Russia itself, and the experience of the mechanism which was used in Iraq, and how far that mechanism is going to be used, the same mechanism or a different mechanism, because to my mind that mechanism did not really achieve the objectives which was thought for. Thank you.
Mr. Feitinger?
Thank you. My question does not go to Mr. Ivanov, it goes to Mr. Pinzón. Mr. Pinzón, you mentioned the importance of external support in developing the country and going forward. What kind of support do you receive nowadays, and can it be seen as a template for other states in the future?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I don't think we got that.
What kind of support do you receive nowadays, mainly from the United States, but also from Europe? And can this kind of support be seen as a template for other states in the future?
Flo de Villas, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you, John. I just wanted to thank Karl Eikenberry for what I thought was an extremely thoughtful analysis of what had gone wrong in Afghanistan and as a lesson for the future. But just on a broader question, the major problem of what went wrong in Afghanistan and earlier in Iraq was forgetting the fundamental lesson that I think even colonial powers knew, and that is that if you break it, you own it. And to what extent does the gradual absorption of that lesson and the fact that there is no way that you can ever really, in a destroyed culture, put back together again, well, that you can go actually, as you said, from Kabul to Copenhagen. I mean, it's in possibly 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, that this actually excludes expeditionary activity by any major power.
Thank you very much. Lots of questions. I'll ask Sergei Ivanov to go first, then Karl Eikenberry, and we'll end with Minister Pinzón. Sergei.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for questions, maybe too many questions. I don't like to turn this debate into a press conference, so I'll try to answer very shortly. First, will Assad abide? I don't know. I'm not clairvoyant. But speaking logically and thinking logically, we have to keep in mind that, first, he doesn't control all his territory. We still don't know where the stockpiles of chemical weapons are geographically. Third, I think it will be clear this week where they all are. And if we agree with the international community, who will step in Syria, in which numbers, then I think the process will start seriously. About Chapter 7. We never exclude it as such. We just say that we don't have clear evidence. And if in future, for example, I'm talking now theoretically and hypothetically, but if we'll become sure, Russia will become sure that Assad, for example, is cheating, we might change our position. But so far we don't have such evidence. 3 countries of the Security Council said that Assad is a culprit. Okay, 2 other countries said no. And there, I think that it might be, again, hypothetically, a realistic scenario that both sides used chemical weapons. And I wonder how the international community will act to that scenario. It's a good question. Then who is the culprit? Al-Qaeda or Assad? North Korea. Well, I just mentioned North Korea because it's, in my view, it's a good example. There was Saddam Hussein, who disarmed, and there were no chemical weapons in Iraq when he was invaded and later hanged. Then there was a politician named Muammar Gaddafi, who also got rid of weapons of mass destruction. And he was very much welcomed in Paris, in London, in the Western world, not in Moscow. Keep that in mind. And then he was toppled. That is also true. So if you think about a North Korean logic, I can understand it. Why should I disarm? Because if I do, I'm ended. But of course, Russia's position on North Korea is that the North Korean government should abide to all international obligations, weapons of mass destruction, and join the international agreement on non-nuclear test ban and things like that. By the way, I have to remind you, it was in 2006, I think, I was a defense minister at the time. The Russian technical device were the first who picked a nuclear test in North Korea and announced it to the whole world 5 minutes after it picked it. Why Syria now? Before that it was Libya, Iraq. We didn't agree with Iraq. We discussed a lot with Condoleezza Rice. I remember hours. We took hours to discuss on Iraq. We said, again, we can't rely on your intelligence. I was shown pictures, space satellite pictures, about some lorries, trucks, allegedly carrying biological weapons, chemical weapons. But later it didn't turn to be true. G8. In fact, there was a consensus in Lochern. There was a statement, and all countries agreed. United States, Russia, and the others. G20, we just finished in St. Petersburg. They also had to discuss Syria, though G8 theoretically has nothing to do with security problems. It's an economic forum. But because of the stress of the situation, we discussed it. President Putin discussed it with Obama. The BRICS countries, Russia, China, Brazil, India, and South Africa, for the first time made a joint statement on Syria. What Russia can do to stop the war in Syria? Only diplomatically. What else can we do? But it's, in fact, Russia is not alone in putting its view on this conflict. There are many countries which support our position. And we are not putting it as a only approach. We just talk what we're thinking is right, and that's it. We think that arming arming the opposition or militants is really dangerous. Because as you all know, there are lots of foreign mercenaries in Syria. And they're the same mercenaries which we fought in Chechnya. They're the same mercenaries which you fought in Mali. It's all the same. They're just moving from one country to another. And who knows where they will appear next. Because eventually, sometime, the Syrian conflict will end this or that way. But where will the terrorists go? That's a good question in my view. They won't disappear. They will continue using the weapons which some countries provide them, and they will use the weapons which they seized in huge numbers in the Libyan arsenals, including shoulder pads. I'm sure General Eikenberry knows what I mean, shoulder pads. A dream of every terrorist to get his hands on a shoulder pad, which he can bring down any helicopter or civilian plane. Thank you.
Karl Eikenberry.
Briefly, I'll take, we respond to 4 of the questions. First of all, on the United States in Afghanistan after 2014 and willingness to try to cooperate with Russia. First of all, we still don't know exactly what our presence, our relationship with Afghanistan will be after 2014. We'll probably get a bilateral security agreement. So to frame it as the United States will be absent and from Afghanistan after 2014, probably not. U.S. and NATO will likely have a military presence in the country if invited and sanctioned by the Afghan government. That could be perhaps 10,000 troops with a security training mission, probably to assist Afghan national security forces on select missions and have a counterterrorist capability. Having said that, as I had said during my remarks, I do firmly believe, given the problematic nature of Afghanistan's future, even with that presence, in terms of the capabilities of its security forces to deal with very significant terrorist threats and a very significant problem with narco-trafficking, which is a challenge coming out of that country that affects the streets of Moscow. I don't know how we will stabilize and provide security to Afghanistan and the region without cooperation from all the major relevant actors, especially Russia. And setting aside the question of CSTO, I do know in Washington there's a strong desire for that cooperation with Russia. Indeed, over recent years, there's been excellent cooperation between the United States and Russia in trying to deal with this problem of narco-trafficking. Secondly, on the question of Syria, just several remarks here. You know, a long-term goal of the United States and the administration has been to find ways to cooperate strategically with Russia on major global challenges. There's also been a desire to find ways to define and enforce international norms on the possession, prevention of the use of weapons of mass destruction. So I know that former President political advisor David Axelrod had said recently that in spite of the last several messy weeks, that if we put this in terms of American baseball, that all that matters in 9 innings of American baseball, 9 innings is the length of the game, that all that the crowd cares about is how does the game look at the end of the 9th inning. So they'll never talk about how it looked in the 4th inning or the 5th inning. And if we look at the last couple of weeks, I guess it looked pretty messy at that point in time. We don't know. It's certainly not the 9th inning right now. But I would say that at this point, we could be in relatively good position, we collectively. I'll make one other point, though, to slightly differ with Russian colleague, and that is when we talk about the use of force, let's be clear why Bashar right now is talking about having international inspectors come in and declaring his chemical weapons stockpile. It's not coincidental that the United States of America, At one point, France, Britain threatened the use of force. It's the potential of the use of force that has achieved that outcome. That's fact. One other point about Syria as well. I entirely take the point about the threat of Islamic terrorist jihadists in Syria and the region. It's also clear that America in some ways has unwittingly contributed to that problem, perhaps with actions over the past decade. But we have to come back to a starting point, too, that the Syrian people initially were peacefully protesting in the spirit of the Arab Spring against a terrible despot who used force against those people. Now, the reason that there's 100,000 Syrian civilians who are dead at this point and several million in refugee camps is not entirely due to al-Qaeda, which is more than a bogeyman, but it's not entirely due to al-Qaeda. So in other words, that we don't necessarily say that we should continue to defend the Tsar because of the potential of Bolshevism. On the point of intervention, and how has that changed American strategy, I made note of that in my remarks. The 2012 Defense Strategic Guidelines that was issued by the Obama administration is pretty clear, I think, in how we're shifting our strategy. But most briefly, I think that as international terrorism remains a concern of all of us here, and it's articulated in the new Defense Strategic Guidance, the change in thinking in the United States and our national security community is that the way we'll deal with that from a Department of Defense, a U.S. military perspective, is with special operations forces and with intelligence. It's not to say that changing conditions in particular countries is not important to eliminate the conditions that may breed international terrorism, but the Department of Defense, which most assuredly over this last decade was very much in that business of social transformation, they're getting out of that business. And then fourth and finally, Fleur, your question about when do we intervene and what's the calculus there? It's not to say that interventions over in recent memories have not been successful. We can certainly point to the Balkans, arguably a great success. The Balkans sitting in the midst of, sitting in part of Europe, that elicited great interest. And it was a problem that was of such a scale that it could be dealt with the United States, Europe, and collective action. Even in the case of Afghanistan, don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of great things that have been accomplished in Afghanistan. Ask the 7 million children in Afghanistan going to school, and 40% of those are girls, and we can continue to give those. I can give you a great list of statistics. The problem gets to one of sustainability. So a prosperous Afghanistan is certainly a noble goal to work for. But the problem is, in the greater scheme of things, it's not a vital national American interest. So we'll look at interventions, I think, as we always have, on a case-by-case basis, and conditions may be correct that will lend themselves towards successful interventions. But I would tell you from my own experience in Afghanistan, as I said, huge level of effort over the last decade that I leave very cautious and skeptical.
Juan Carlos Pinzón.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. In lessons terms, I think that in our country, certainly our military and our society has clearly understand, and we have learned that to solve conflict is not just a matter of security effort, it's not just a matter of bullets, being very practical. It's a comprehensive effort. It requires an integrated approach, and it requires to understand that beyond the struggle itself, there are reasons that should be tackled as well. And I think that's maybe the main lesson that is allowing Colombia to really become a very different country from the failed state we were 12 years ago to the country that expects to become prosperous and participant of world peace and stability. I think that people support was critical. I think that leadership, both from President Uribe, President Santos, has been very important. I think that the commitment to bring rule of law and legitimacy to the armed forces has become very important. Certainly we have developed capabilities with US support. I have to be frank on this. Intelligence, special operations, mobility, professionalism, and higher standards. I think those lessons are today available to the world. One of the most important aspirations of Colombian defense sector is to continue to offer this experience to other countries. Right now we have trained members of the military or the police of 45 countries, particularly in our Western Hemisphere, in Central America and Caribbean, almost 9,000 in the past 2 years. And we will continue to offer this experience to whomever thinks that our case could be useful. We are right now discussing on the future, on the transformation of the armed forces. But that transformation will come as a buildup from what we have learned. We don't think conventional conflicts are really something that is probable, particularly in the region, but we think that those capabilities to fight drug trafficking and transnational crime are more and more useful, not only now for Colombia, but to be offered to world peace and stability. We're looking to other prospects in our future. So Pacific Alliance, as you know, John, very well, becomes one of the most interesting political and economic efforts in the region. Mexico, Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, and Colombia. All of us have the same kind of understanding of democracy. And somehow all of us are looking to the Pacific. And I think the Pacific Basin has become part of world economic development opportunities, and certainly for our countries. Then I had a very specific question. Is peace process going to happen this year? From a Minister of Defense stance, I will tell you that we will continue to pressure as hard as we can. We will continue to defeat their finances, their armed structures, everything we can in order to help them to understand that the faster they come to an agreement, to the generosity, not from President Santos, but from the Colombian people, who continues to have a big, strong will for peace. When you ask in Colombia, do you want peace? Around 80% of the people will say yes. The problem is when you ask, what will you be ready to give them? And that's when people really will not have such a support. So that's the kind of discussion we're in the middle of. I don't think the peace process will come to an end this year, but I think if we continue to pressure, somehow, at some point, we will have an end of 50-year conflict. Why does President Santos have a popularity drop? I think the answer is kind of simple. Spending political capital is what leadership is all about. And talking about peace and trying to open a discussion between peace and justice becomes quite costly. I think that people will value very much if this comes to an end and will continue to penalize if we continue to be in the middle. At the same time, as I said, we will continue to pressure. Just let me give you some final numbers. FARC has decreased in the past 2 years 26% in the armed structures and 15% in the network structures. So we continue to weaken them to a point in which they will not have a different alternative. And if I go back 10 years ago, around 50% of the country was being affected by terrorism or that kind of subversive action. Today, 92% of the country, you can say, lives in some kind of post-conflict, in which street crime now becomes the threat. Not anymore is terrorism, not anymore is drug trafficking as we knew it, but is more regular security conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, if anyone ever doubted that this was the global strategic review, I think those doubts were laid to rest with the breadth of commentary that we've had in this opening session. Please join me in thanking Sergei Ivanov, Karl Eikenberry, and Juan Carlos Pinzón.